Good morning. My name is Eric Clark, and welcome to Resistance Seminars. These seminars I have been running every Wednesday at noon Eastern Time to invite people into a conversation about how we can be equipped and activated for the work of resistance in our culture, in our society, in our church, around us right now, given the climate and the context that we're living in. We have been working our way through the book Faithful Resistance by Rick Ufford Chase and a number of different contributors who have joined me week by week on this live stream to talk about the book, as well as to go beyond the book and to talk about broader subjects. And today I am thrilled to have with me Alex McNeil, who is the executive director of More Light Presbyterians, and also one of the persons whose story is told in the Out of Order documentary that many of you may have seen. And if you haven't seen it yet, you should find an opportunity to go see it soon, because it's really excellent. I got to see it at GA last year, and it was amazing. So it's well worth your time. So Alex, great to have you on. Good to meet you, man.
Yeah, thanks, Eric. I'm really excited to be chatting with you today about this here book.
Yeah. So why don't you start this morning by just telling us a little bit about your particular biography and about the work you do with More Light Presbyterians to kind of provide a context for the conversation we're going to have.
Sure. The real quick snapshot is I grew up Presbyterian from back. My grandparents and my mom and now me growing up going to church. And when we were growing up, my family moved around a lot, and we always ended up, no matter what town we were in, at a First Presbyterian church. And I didn't actually know there were other kinds of Presbyterian churches beyond First for a long time. It's embarrassing. But I identify now as a transgender man. And that means that I grew up as a girl and was raised as a girl until I was in my mid-20s. And growing up and moving around so much, going to school wasn't always the place where I felt I could be the most myself. But it was actually at church that I felt I could be, fully who I was, the kid that was running around the fellowship hall and clanging the handbell choirs. And I felt like church became my home. So I signed up for every opportunity I could to be back at church on weeknights and Sunday afternoons, and in the morning working with my mom, who's a Christian education director, putting out little crackers for the kids who were coming in for Sunday school. And it was when I was finishing high school that I came out to my parents as both a lesbian and as wanting to go to seminary. And it was in the late 90s when I did that. And I kind of naively thought that, of course, I can, be ordained in the Presbyterian Church, even though there were laws in place at the time that specifically were not going to allow me to move forward in that ordination process. But I knew that the church had been a home to me, and I wanted it to feel like a home for other people. And so that's where my sense of call really started to develop. Then I went to college and met people for whom the church had not been a place of home, who had been kicked out of their own homes by their parents because of their parents' Christian beliefs after they'd come out, or their parents were welcoming, but their churches were not. And it was about that time that I realized that perhaps my calling was not just to make the church a home in a general way, but to work specifically on how the church can be a home for LGBT people, because I think that foundation is actually a starting point to help church feel like a welcoming place for everybody. So after seminary and beginning my transition process, my gender transition, I started church shopping when I'd moved to a new town. And that's part of the story that I tell in Faithful Resistance, of being a, post-seminary grad, got my little degree and moving to a new town, trying to find a church where I can just simply belong, because I couldn't be ordained in the church at that time. I was working at a nonprofit. And it was in visiting a bunch of churches that called themselves welcoming that I realized that welcome is more than just a statement. That what we say about ourselves doesn't always reach the smiles people give you when they shake your hand at the end of coffee hour. because I was doing so as a person who was raised female and still working on my gender identity. And so for a lot of people, they didn't quite know how to place me in a box of male or female the minute they saw me. And that meant that they were almost uncomfortable talking to me, in my understanding that they didn't quite know how to address me. And so that just meant they wanted to stay silent. And part of this chapter is resisting the seduction of silence, that I think we get up in our own heads about the interaction we're about to have with somebody, and we're unable to have an authentic conversation with them in the moment, because we're in our heads like, I don't want to say the wrong thing. It's a very genuine place. I don't want to say the wrong thing. And so I may not say anything at all, which can feel to someone who's feeling very vulnerable in one of those spaces as a rejection or a coldness that I don't think is actual intent. So anyway, as I started the transition process, it was about the same time that the church was working on Amendment 10A to officially change the Book of Order, kind of the paragraph around G601 and 6B. So I said,
so I'm gonna jump in real quick for those who are watching who maybe aren't Presbyterian. We're using some lingo which is referring to our organizational processes, our polity, the rules which basically at that point in time prohibited ordination of persons who were LGBTQ, but mainly that's what it was intended for. It was actually written to exclude people who were not in a heterosexual marriage or celibate outside a heterosexual marriage, using that framing of the language. I think chastity, not celibacy, was actually the word that was used. But that was the debate in the denomination a few years back. And then since then, we've also moved on the issue of marriage as well. So ordination and marriage are the two big things that the Presbyterians have been debating in the past decade. Go ahead, continue.
Sure. So I essentially said to myself, I can't really consider myself to be a Presbyterian anymore if I don't get involved in helping to have conversations in the larger church around changing this policy. And that is how I got involved with More Light Presbyterians, first as a volunteer. And it really taught me the value of having deeply rooted conversations about our faith with folks who may or may not agree with us, so that we can really share what is most deeply held about why we remain in our particular churches or denominations. And it was from there that I really recommitted to the ordination process and to working within this specific denomination. So fast forward a few years later, More Light Presbyterians was at a critical turning point in our work, and I was invited to apply to the position of executive director. And I've been really fortunate to serve in this position since 2013, in the middle of a moment around trying to decide how we're going to change our church's policies around marriage, as the larger country was having a conversation around marriage. But also, I believe it was a critical moment to think about, what does it mean to be a specifically LGBT inclusive organization in this moment of denominational and cultural change? How might we be called to lead the conversation forward following some of these policy changes? Because we know that policy does not always equal practice. So I really feel that our calling and my calling is to help people and individuals to live into LGBT inclusion. And this chapter really crystallizes some of how I see that happening.
Fabulous. Okay, so much in there that was really fascinating and a great place for us to have some conversation. I know I want to definitely talk to you about the experience of being in the ordination process, like over that time period where it was in flux and debate about how it was going to go and what your personal experience was there. I know I've heard some other stories for some other people in that regard as well. And also, the work that More Light Presbyterians has identified going forward of trying to work in the church for that, making that welcome visible and translating the policy into practice. I think those are both some areas that are really important. So But let us like first, in looking at this book, in this chapter that Alex McNeil contributed, one of the things that was really beautiful in this is how you identify the fact that church for you really was a place of home growing up, and then the tension that entered in later in your adult life as that childhood experience of church being home became somewhat problematized by the debate over inclusion. I'm curious, the churches that you were in growing up, were they consider themselves open and affirming? Were they at that time part of the Covenant Network, or more like Presbyterians, or was this just something that it wasn't yet on your horizon or on their horizon, and so then the welcome that you experienced or the warmth that you experienced wasn't shaped by that yet?
That's a great question. My very first church left the denomination. Yeah, so
Yeah.
it's been a gamut. That first church where I ran around the fellowship hall is no longer in the Presbyterian Church USA. The church where I am under care and have been under care for ordination has been making steps to be intentionally inclusive. It was just beginning to be part of the conversation as I was growing up. It is not yet a more light church, but I think it did some specific things to foster a welcome atmosphere. And I actually think churches have this wonderful ability, when at their best, to let people just be themselves, to accept people for who they are without really, questioning why someone is who they are. Churches attract characters. And I think that though it wasn't specifically part of the conversation, and I didn't come out until after high school, I felt like it was a safe environment to do so.
That's fascinating. So that's interesting, because some of the stuff you talk about in terms of welcome you make the point that it's important that welcome be visible, and so the identity and the signage, declaring oneself open and affirming, or whatever language you use, that's important. But you then go beyond how that's really not, it's by itself sufficient, which I think in another way could be talked about, how it's possible that churches, even churches that haven't made official declarations of welcome, might be working on some of these other aspects of welcome, looking at ways that their the power of the words they use in their worship, in the language that they use around like gender. So like this includes conversations about the use of like non-gendered language for God, or multi-gendered language for God, and the way that we choose to frame those conversations also impacts the ability of a church to be welcoming to different people.
Yeah, I think that I grew up, the church where my family moved when I was in late middle school through high school and now under care. I grew to understand this was a welcoming place through 15 years of participation in that church. I often think about why we need to make welcome visible, not necessarily just for the folks within the congregation, but for people outside of, who are in the community, who assume, the number one assumption is that Christianity is not affirming of LGBTQ folks. So I believe that as congregations, we're called to be more visible, so that people in our surrounding context know that we're a place that they can bring their full selves to. Obviously, LGBT people participate in all kinds of churches, whether welcoming or non. But there's something very powerful about a congregation deciding, here we are in South Georgia, and we want to be a welcoming place and let folks in the community know. And that doesn't just translate to LGBT people feeling affirmed and welcomed, but it also translates to families who want to raise their kids in an environment where they're not going to hear negative messages or homophobic messages. So
absolutely. I won't take my kids to a church. I for my job, visit lots of different churches, but I won't take my kids to a church where the theology that's expressed and the language that's used would be exclusive of people who I know are their friends and who might be my children. My children haven't worked out their sexuality yet, so that that's important to me, and I know it's important to many other parents out there as well.
Right, and I think having clear language helps folks who may not have a master's in divinity to be able to nuance the subtleties of what people are saying on their church websites, so that it's very easy to tell right away that actually this place has made a commitment, not just in their words but in their deeds as well, to being an inclusive place.
We have someone in the chat who's asking a question, which I'd like to put to you. So Matt Price is asking, to what extent is it okay for cis folk to ask LGBTQ folk to explain or educate about their experience? The context I'm thinking of is Sunday coffee at church after service. And he clarifies, I know it's often inappropriate for white people to expect Black people to provide education. Is there a correlation here for straight or gay relationships? And a reason he thinks it might be different is that the history of race in America is something that it's easier to learn about with a little effort, while sexual gender identity can be much more personal. So that's a lot there for you to talk about.
Well, thanks for this question, Matt. I really kind of get the sense that you're wanting to be able to bring in diverse experiences into a context that may not have an opportunity to have that conversation. What I really recommend for people who are seeking to have additional voices at the table, I think in a one-to-one interaction, like, so if Eric and I are hanging out at coffee hour and he says to me, so Alex, tell me everything about transgender experience, after you just had
everything,
a long worship service and I'm maybe tired. I think that's maybe not the right context, but if Eric were to come to me and say, hey, Alex, I know that you work on LGBT inclusion, and I'd love to put together a kind of public conversation or panel so that we can have more in-depth learning about that. That, to me, puts a boundary around how that conversation is going to happen. Sometimes, we've all been a little hijacked at coffee hour about whatever topic that may go on and on and on and on, even, carpeting the new sanctuary, for example. But to have a specific educational forum or event or book reading or movie allows for a container for that conversation, so that if you're inviting someone in who has some skills and ability to do that education, has also built up tools to be able to field questions that may come from left field or maybe inappropriate, but can do so with grace that you want to have when you want to learn and discover. So I think that it's definitely okay to ask individuals to share their experience, but what I would advocate for is that you figure out some way to formalize that conversation so that it's not just happening all over the place, rather than in one setting where we can have kind of a kind of Q&A time or something that's moderated, so that it doesn't feel like it goes out of control. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting and important point you bring up, which I hadn't thought about in this context before, which is that it's not just about a person's personal experience, but it's also about people who have developed tools and skills to have this conversation. In other words, the same thing applies in various other conversations. I was once told, for example, even by an author, that if I'm at a book signing or I'm at a public event about my work, then talking to me about my work is appropriate. But if I'm sitting at a cafe, coming up to me and interrupting my lunch to demand that I tell you about my writing is inappropriate. So talking with people who have this as part of their the work they do, then approaching them in the context of inviting them in a way that's related to their work in a formal way, or in a way that provides, as you say, boundaries for how that conversation happens, is a great approach, versus, say, as you brought up, the one-on-one hijacking in a coffee hour, or just sort of demanding someone who's personal experiences related to the conversation you want to have that they explain. It may be that that's their experience, but they might not have developed the tools for having that conversation in a way that they can feel safe and confident in having that conversation.
And I would say that there's actually a lot of books out right now from people who are willing to tell their stories. And so maybe that's one place to start. We have a host of them on the More Light Presbyterian's website under resources, under various categories, so that you could check it out. And that might be an initial conversation you want to have. And then maybe you want to bring in a formal training, and then maybe bring in a panels of people to speak. A church that I was just working with had a 3-part series. Actually, it was a 4-part series on gender identity. And they started with a professor from the local university who works on sexuality and gender identity. Then they had a panel of students from like they were a university church. So they had a panel of students from the local university who were not necessarily specifically involved with the faith community, but they told their stories. And then they had me come in to kind of talk about my experience both within the faith context as well as doing some specific conversations around gender identity. And I thought that was a really neat way to reinforce some of the learnings and build on some of the learnings. And so I would say that looking around in your community, is there an LGBT state group, like state level group that you could ask for speakers? Are there other LGBT specific welcoming congregations that you might reach out to? And then you can always follow up with me and I'll see if I know anyone in your area that might be equipped and ready to do that kind of conversation.
Fabulous. Another aspect that you brought up in your introduction about yourself, which I thought was really useful for lots of avenues of this conversation about resistance, was the fact that if churches work hard on making them welcoming spaces for LGBTQ persons, that it will have the effect of making them welcoming spaces for all persons. And this is something that I've been trying to work with and toward various groups and talking about solidarity work in various forms, that if we place the most vulnerable persons in a given situation or context at the center of our work, that has the effect of creating of building toward a dynamic where it will be good for everyone in that process. So I wonder if you might think out loud a little bit about how the work for LGBTQ inclusion works at a broader level to make the church a more welcoming place for everyone.
I'll go very specific with this one. And the thing that we talk about a lot, specifically around transgender inclusion, is bathrooms. And if you think about it, so one of the recommendations for a trans or gender inclusive bathroom is to have a single stall, lockable bathroom, set aside. Many churches have those. And if you think about it, a lot of times, like, who needs a bigger bathroom? Folks with physical disabilities, parents who need to change their kiddos' diapers, and trans folks who just need a place to go to the bathroom in peace. I think that small example is one way that you're actually meeting a lot of different people's needs. Maybe you're preparing for a job interview after church and you need to change clothes, or like how many people might need to use a bigger bathroom to be able to kind of go about their lives in a way that I think addresses multiple points of people's identities. Mm-hmm. I also think that
I was going to actually add to that specific experience. We have a congregation that I'm working with right now that has been trying to expand its outreach for people experiencing homelessness. And one of the things that's been a constant need is, places to like wash face and hands and clothes. So a bigger sink or a shower, a single stall bathroom where you can do more than just use the restroom. And so that is, we've been addressing it from that we need to put a single stall bathroom in here that is, got some extra resources in it, because it also makes our church more hospitable to people experiencing homelessness as well.
Exactly. A church in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, who is often a place where hurricane or flood victims come, redid their whole educational wing to include 2 showers and 2 big bathrooms for families that can live there an extended time, but it's also a place where you can designate it as a gender neutral, just like a bathroom in your own house. But the thing I wanted to say is I also believe that when we become intentionally inclusive on one element, whether it's race, whether it's ability, whether it's LGBT identities, I believe that that is a lens that we apply to bringing awareness to other places folks are feeling marginalized. So even the practice of noticing where folks may be feeling left out or not included, or how our space confines are not set up to be the most welcoming, that sensitivity and ability and that muscle certainly translates. So a lot of churches that become more intentionally open and affirming or more light will say to me, well, LGBT inclusion was just the beginning of the conversation. And in our welcoming statement, we wanted to make sure we included immigration status, race, ability, so that people truly knew that this church was equipping themselves to have that sensitivity across a lot of different factors.
Joe Ritako in the chat wanted to continue a little bit in the question off of Matt's question earlier. He says, how about if you're interested in having a one-to-one conversation to learn and ask to get is it, good idea to ask to get together for coffee or lunch or a meeting as a place to start that could then lead to something more formal with the rest of the congregation?
I think that's a great idea, Joe. I think that follows my logic around providing parameters around a conversation to say to someone, hey, I'm really interested to hear more about your story. Would you like to get together for coffee or lunch? And what's great about a one-on-one conversation, and I think that I'd like for us to keep in mind, is it's not a one-direction conversation, a one-directional conversation. That if Eric's asking me about myself, I'd love to know more about Eric too, so that you're also being willing to share some of your own experiences and story, because that is how we build the relationship, period. And then I think if you're prepared to do that'll help someone else feel more comfortable kind of getting more into the nitty gritty, rather than you want someone to come out to coffee for you for like, basically you're going to watch a movie of their life. And I agree that could also lead to then saying, Eric, you have a really compelling story. I'd wonder if you'd be willing to share that with our Sunday school class sometime, right? So that invitation begets invitation, and can lead to some cool possibilities. So great question.
So before we got on this morning, as we were talking about some of the things we want to talk about, one of the things that came up that is that I think is really juicy that I'd like to talk about a little bit. You mentioned actually in just your conversation about how talking about welcome can be a lens, talking about welcome for LGBTQ persons or on issues of race or on issues of immigration, that these are ways that we build these muscles that then apply in other situations as well. And it makes it sense to me that this is also the case when we talk about like at the movement level in our culture. When we look at various movements that are happening in our culture right now, there is crossover and cross-pollination with LGBTQ particular forms of resistance. And I wonder if you might want to talk about how you see lessons that have been learned in the movement for inclusion for LGBTQ persons that have crossed over into other movements in our culture.
I woke up on the day after the election, after I'd had my first feelings of rage and just outrage, feeling like a sense of calm in some ways, that I believe it's the LGBT movement that has been working for the past 40 years, often in hostile environments, in times of silence, in times of repression and downplaying the effect of our work, that we're prepared for this moment to bring out some of the most creative lessons we've learned about resistance and have been perfecting in other movements to the table, to be able to survive and thrive in this kind of new administration. So I think about even the first act of More Light was Reverend David Sent standing on the floor of General Assembly with a sign that said, "Is anyone else out there gay?" 1974. And I think that act of creative and beautiful disruption is one that has been almost kind of one of our best tools in times and moments when we're not getting any official recognition from the higher levels of government or legislative bodies. So, and I also believe, Eric and I were talking a little earlier about the use of joy in resistance, that I think queer folks, some of our movements also began at Stonewall, at a dance club. That dancing and joy and community building are some of the most fundamental pieces that we need right now to find our people and our tribe and others who want to join us, because who doesn't want to join something joyful?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there was, in the days immediately post the inauguration, there were dance parties that like blocked off the road around Mike Pence's house and leading up to the White House. And I love that framing. It's a form of protest, a form of resistance, but a form which also like self-describes and presents itself in a way that is intentionally joyful and inclusive and inviting. If you've ever been, present at any Pride Parade or any of these things, my experience always has been, whenever I have been present, is the constant invitation. Like, I'm constantly being invited in to dance and in to party and in to celebrate with, which is just astounding and life-giving experience.
Because I think joy is the best tool of resistance we have, and in this moment where we're constantly barraged with things that feel hopeless, to maintain a sense of hope and joyfulness in the midst of that is the number one way we're not going to be silenced, and we're going to be able to continue and persevere throughout this administration.
Mm-hmm. Well, and it's particularly relevant to and from the LGBT experience because of the fact that as opposed to race, which we primarily code around skin color, it's possible to be invisible, for sexuality to be invisible in ways that race it's not possible to be. So the necessity of making it visible and making it refusing to be silenced, refusing to be silenced, is a lesson that I think that is really comes out of the LGBT experience particularly.
And I think draws upon the power of allies and people who there's a real seduction of silence, so that when folks who don't necessarily identify as LGBT speak out, I think like part of like what you're talking about in the Pride Parade is like wanting to adding people into the parade. Come march with us. And there's a real invitational language there that I think we can continue to extend outward.
Mm-hmm. In the chat again, Matt is asking, thinking of joy in dancing, should we make our worship more gay? What might that look like to integrate queer sensibility into worship?
Yes, I love that question. That's resisting the frozen chosen. I agree. I really think that as welcome necessitates an examination of how we worship together. So if we're a multiracial church, my hope is that we're not following a very white model of worship, that we're thinking about what other kinds of cultures and communities might influence our worship practices together. And, it's a little in jest, Matt's question, with, I think, a serious undertone, that how might we incorporate more expressions of joy, maybe even, queer poets or songs. I mean, you can't open the hymn book without singing a song written by an LGBT person, whether they're open about it or closeted. So if we actually intentionally acknowledge that, like what kind of power might that bring to, I think that there's this really beautiful part of naming particularities to get to a universal experience that I believe we're invited into when we look at how our worship experiences might be more and diverse and inclusive.
Mm-hmm. Well, and in my conversations with other people that are doing some of this work, there is also an ethos of queer as a verb, to queer spaces, to queer culture, to queer experiences, and I think that I think that there is actually an ethos that says that doing this is itself a sort of radical act, the purpose of which is to challenge the assumption that there really is such a thing as a straight space or a cis space or a space that is normative or normal, to try and make visible the fact that really even the assumptions we have about what is normative, those assumptions themselves are kind of false. They're lies. They rest on a willingness not to examine it that closely.
Absolutely.
So, and then I also see here, Jeffrey Todd is asking, he's saying, Alex, thanks for your contributions to the book. He wonders if you can speak specifically to any experiences you have helping explore issues of inclusiveness versus exclusion with church councils. So like sessions or presbytery or you know, institutional bodies of church.
Yeah. I really advocate in exploring those conversations within specific church councils, that I really advocate for a process, that it's not, I think sometimes people, when they want their church to be a welcoming and an open church and they want to change the church statement, they come to session and the first question is like, let's take a vote on this, rather than doing some of that background education and discernment around why might we want to or feel called to specifically be a welcome and affirming church. What are the needs in our community? What are the realities that we're living in? So in terms of experiences, the best experiences I've had are when we approach church councils with curiosity and exploration around, what are you seeing in the community? What are some of the conversations you're having? What are you seeing out in the world that might encourage us to take this kind of a stand? And then if folks say, well, I don't think anyone's getting discriminated against, then that tells you something, that actually maybe there's some room to do a little education gracefully around some of the lived realities of maybe even people in your own town. So in terms of that experience, I would advocate to think about what kind of process might you take. And so there's this toolkit called Building an Inclusive Church that was developed out of the best practices of organizations like More Light and other ecumenical groups. And I can put the link in the chat in a minute. And it's a free toolkit, free download, and you can read through the ways in which we might go about a process, and the whole experience is built around building relationships, because the worst thing that can happen is that a church feels divided about this kind of a decision. So if we go about this in terms of like even reaching out to people who we think may not support this kind of decision, and building a relationship with them, that ultimately, no matter what happens, it leads to a more powerful community.
I have put that toolkit into the chat there, and I'm going to put it in the description below the video, though, for any who watch this later on. They'll be able to see it there too. Down below the video, you should be able to find that link.
Perfect.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And I also think there's something worth talking about here in terms of engaging with official structures of the church that is work for work for allies to do. When I was ordained before 10A. I was ordained under the period of time when the Peace, Unity, Purity report, and I know I'm using some Presbyterian speak here, require or offered the opportunity for people to scruple. And so what I had to do is I had to submit a statement of exception saying, I find this portion of our polity to be out of sync with our theology, and I am objecting to it officially as part of my ordination, which meant that they had to decide when they went to ordain me whether or not that was sufficient enough of a breach to prevent my being ordained, and they had to debate whether or not I could be ordained. When I went into the ordination process, I had a choice to make about whether or not to do it. I could have passed through, right? I'm a cisgendered, straight, white man with a wife and kids. Like it would have been easy for me to sort of pass through the process without controversy. But I had the choice to make, and the choice for me was essentially, can I look myself in the mirror in the morning as and consider myself, a friend, like personally, of people I know who are struggling to get through the ordination process, because for them they can't be invisible. We're talking about that seduction of silence. For me, it was possible to be silent, where it wouldn't have been possible for some other people to be silent through that process. So I chose not to be. So I chose to scruple and to put my ordination at risk, entering a conservative presbytery, in ordination, because to me that was the necessary cost of being a friend. That I had to be in a position where when it was when something was on the line for myself, that I was clear, that I was visible in my stance and my statement. And similarly, at other points in my career, I found the same compelling need at times to make myself visible in opposition to injustices that don't permit them to go on. So later on, when we were debating marriage, there was a policy in my presbytery that was instituted that was designed to basically get around the marriage issue, to try and force clergy to abide by standards of sexuality in the Bible without having to use the Book of Order. It was like a policy that all clergy had to sign. And so I initiated a personal protest to this policy, where I would report myself for masturbation to the presbytery, because it was something that could theoretically be interpreted as being against the codes and conducts of Scripture. The point was to point out the absurdity of the policy and to force the presbytery to confront the injustice, unjust nature of the policy. The fact that by attempting to exclude certain people, in reality, they were setting up an impossible standard that really would exclude everyone. And so just to sort of force the question, to not permit it to be able to remain silent. And I think that's work that we all have to engage in, regardless of how we identify, with our sexuality or our gender.
I think that there's a role, again, also to notice who's not at the table, who's not on the committees on ministry, who's not on a nominating committee, to really intentionally make those representative and diverse, so that different perspectives are included in hiring processes or in call processes. I think one of the things we're seeing now, post changes in our denominational policies around ordination, is that congregations who are seeking an ordained pastor often will have a bank of great candidates, and maybe one of them will be openly LGBT, and often that person's the number 2 candidate and doesn't get chosen because maybe the white heterosexual person has been able to work in ministry for 10 years and has a specific direct ratio skill set to show that they've been a senior pastor before. Whereas, an LGBT candidate may have been working in senior management levels in an organization that wasn't a church, but in the PIF process, it doesn't always translate that person has that kind of background. So I think sometimes churches will say they don't want someone seeking a first call because they want a more senior level pastor. Well, what that does kind of unintentionally is exclude people who have a great career behind them, but are now in their first call because the church is finally in a place that they could seek ordination. So in terms of looking at all levels of our denomination, how do we, as folks who are mindful of the discrimination that LGBT folks have experienced, be a voice to say, you know, I think this is actually a really great candidate. Maybe they don't have the senior pastor same experiences, but they have comparable experiences that we can, I think, will make sure that they're prepared for this position. So I think it's up to us in some ways to actually be those interrogators, be those people who have that mindfulness, so that our church can be a more just and inclusive place.
Nice use of the slogan of more light. So as we think about the moment that we're living in as a society, we see a retrenchment of and attitudes and forces in our culture that are aiming intentionally to sort of undo some of the work of the past decade. The most visible example recently was the reversing of the executive order regarding transgender bathrooms in, you know, that Trump signed. But it's not just there. It's going to be at every level. It's going to be the appointment of judges. It's going to be the way that works its way out through our political system in the next however many years we have to enter this administration. So thinking beyond the church, or I'd rather than thinking of internal to the church, how do you think about the church's work in relation to society to resist this moment? How does the church act in society to push back against this direction that society is moving?
I think particularly given that the rollback of these protections, including religious exemptions, religious refusals, is being done in the name of Christianity, that Christian churches and Christian individuals have a particular call to put their faith into action, to resist some of the language as well as the policies in ways that they can in their community. So just because Trump rolled back protections at the school level doesn't mean that it means that our churches have a particular opportunity to be advocates for trans kids being able to use a bathroom that corresponds with their gender identity. We can create spaces within our sanctuaries and congregations that are intentionally inclusive, including gender neutral facilities. And the other thing I've seen, I live in North Carolina and actually just moved back to my home state 2 weeks before House Bill 2 passed last year, and which, among other things, was around banning cities from having non-discrimination protections, rolling back those that were in place, and of course the most famous one around public bathroom access. And it's people of faith here in North Carolina that are pushing back the hardest. We just had a training with over 100 people of faith across North Carolina who want to be advocates in their legislature, as well as educating their communities about what this actually means. I think that we're facing a lot of ignorance, especially around transgender protections or lack thereof, about what actually the needs are. And so if we can equip ourselves, what if a whole congregation, 250 or, however many folks decided they wanted to do a workshop to help be able to speak more specifically around transgender inclusion. And then we went out and talked to our neighbors. When we're in the line at the grocery store, if you hear someone saying something wild about transgender people, that you have the language to push back. Mm-hmm. So I see that some of the best organizing out there is actually from the perspective of people of faith, because I think we have a deep-rooted tradition from which we can draw. That's not just about God includes everyone, but that God formed us for such a time as this. So actually, More Light is launching a teach-in series. We did one on racial justice in the fall, and we're doing one around trans inclusion, a 3-part series launching in March, because we know that it's so imperative that we have the tools to have this conversation, not just from the particularities of transgender experience, but also a theology of trans inclusion, and then also how we can lift our voices to be most active in this moment. So we're going to be sending out some information about that in the coming days. But if you keep a watch on More Light's Facebook page or on our website, mlp.org, we'll be announcing it where you can sign up and do a kind of similar webinar to this with some interaction pieces as well. Lastly, I'll just say that I think our congregations, we have such a call, and it can be scary with so many things that are going on to feel like we're being pulled in a lot of directions. But I think that we as people of faith have always been intersectional in some ways, doing homeless ministries at the same time that we're doing work on immigration, at the same time that we want to be a welcoming space. And I think it's time to just really lean into that, to be able to be the most kind of effective at resistance in these times that want to divide our communities among identity lines, that we say from a place of faith, no, we're not going to fall into that trap.
Yeah. Well, and interestingly, I think in continuing the theme of resisting the seduction of silence, since the assumption in our culture is that to be Christian means to be anti-LGBT, then to be visible as Christians, standing up for the inclusion and the rights and protections, just the right to access the bathroom facility that corresponds to your gender identity, it is in a way to it will not in a way, it's directly to counter that assumption and to therefore can be really powerful. So for that purpose, showing up to organizing events, to protests, showing up to town hall meetings and city halls visibly as Christians in that moment, and to say, I'm here as a pastor, I'm here as a member of my congregation, I'm here as a this, to oppose this or to stand for this, that function that serves to undermine the narrative that is trying to be pushed by the current administration, that this is really the desire of all of white Christian America, and we need to make that, we need to push back against that as hard as we can.
And I think, to your point, Eric, it can be as simple as a phrase or two at the beginning of our testimony, at the beginning of our letter to the editor, at the beginning of our conversation with our neighbor, like, as a Christian, as a Presbyterian, as a pastor, that just helps contextualize the rest of what we say as being based on how we understand our faith. I don't think we need to have some sort of degree in theology to be able to make that resistance known, but it's enough to say that as a person of faith, I believe we are called to treat everyone as a child of God, period. Right?
Right.
And the more we say that, the less people are able to claim that Christianity is against any community, on principle.
Yeah, no, and I long for the day when when it's obvious that being a Christian means standing up for injustice. I saw a church last week that was actually, this was in relation to refugees, but it was talking about, of course, the sign just said, of course we welcome refugees, we're Christians. I long for a society that sees Christianity that way, that understands Christianity. Of course we stand up for the rights of all oppressed peoples, all marginalized groups in our society. We're Christians. Of course we do that. Yeah. We're Christians.
And for me, the good news that I've seen is that when we have these moments of extreme injustice, it serves as a wake-up call for congregations and people who felt like it was obvious already that they were welcoming. So after House Bill 2 happened in North Carolina, we got tons of calls of churches that wanted trans-inclusive education because they saw the need for it, even as they thought, well, we thought we were inclusive, but now we've learned what we don't know. And so I feel really hopeful and inspired by that at the end of this administration, and hopefully beyond, we can say, like, we actually built a really strong progressive faith, that we kind of lived into these values that we've been building on for so long, and it became very visible and a connected community. And I think books like this are ways that we can see all of the intersections and connectivity that help build out that robust sense of where God is calling us.
Yeah, and toward the end of this chapter, you give a list of additional ways that churches can work on their welcome, and I think that phrase you just said really helps crystallize it for me. Is the well, we thought we were welcoming, but we learned. I think that phrase actually is one that we might just want to keep in our lexicon all the time. We thought we had worked on this, but we've now learned, and keep that process of learning going, because the reality is that there's no like final point, right? There's no end destination. We've arrived, we've fixed all the problems. There's no longer going to be any work for us to do, and there's always going to be ongoing work for better seeing and understanding whoever is currently other to us in that conversation. So it's good for us to keep that habit of continually re-examining ourselves and continually re-examining our attitudes, habits, behaviors, and how they impact other people around us.
Absolutely.
David Ensign in the chat asks, as you connect with people across the country since the election, what do you hear are the most pressing needs for public witness, particular issues that you think we should be paying attention to?
That's a great question. A lot of what I've talked with folks about is, for so many years in the Presbyterian Church specifically, we've been trained to keep our eyes on the national picture around policy change or polity change within the church. What I see as the need is looking locally and regionally and statewide around what opportunities, what's moving in our state levels around particular policies. So recently there was a call for people, for pastors to sign on to an amicus brief around the Gavin Grimm case that's moving forward to the Supreme Court. Now that's a national issue, but it comes out of Virginia. The case comes out of Virginia, and we collected over 1,800 clergy signing on to this amicus brief, which is incredible. We saw recently Tennessee legislators basically declared a war on LGBT people. And so for folks who are in blue states, or in states that aren't facing these kinds of threats or attacks, I would recommend being a friend to your colleague in states that are facing some pretty devastating policies moving forward. You know, how might you support them? Do you need to come preach for them while they go to the state legislature? You know, really making sure that we can support each other across state boundaries, but that individual congregants also know that they can have an opportunity to speak to their pastor to say, hey, I really support you taking some specific stands. Maybe we could get a group together to go to the state house. Because I think that we're going to be called upon more and more to march from worship into the streets, right? To participate in the protest on Saturday and go to worship on Sunday. So how might we accommodate our worship experience to be able to provide for those commitments out in the community? And keeping our eyes on what's happening locally and like filtering that back up into the national scope.
That's awesome. Alex, we are drawing toward the end of our time here. It has been a fabulous conversation. I would like to have you close with words of encouragement, any words of encouragement for how people can go and be out there doing the hard work of resistance. So while you're thinking of what you're going to close with, I want to just remind people that these are the resistance seminars. I'm doing them every Wednesday morning at noon Eastern. So not morning if you're on the East Coast, but every Wednesday at noon Eastern. And we're working through right now Faithful Resistance by Rick Ufford Chase. Next week, I'm going to have Rabia Terry Harris with me, who is the contributor on the chapter about multi-faith worlds and learning nonviolence in a multi-faith world. She is just a wonderful writer and thinker and Muslim who is going to be on to talk with us about multi-faith context, multi-faith community, and how to work on building our skills and capacities for nonviolence. So I hope that you'll join me for that next week. If you want to do more with these resistance seminars in between, you can join the Facebook group and join us in the conversation there. If you want to support my work online, you can support me on Patreon, which the link is also for all of those things below. And I'm glad that you were with us today for this conversation. So Alex, as we finish up the conversation for today, what words of encouragement would you like to give for people to engage in this work of resistance?
The thing that I keep coming back to when I am encouragement myself is that resistance can start as small as the words that you say and grow into the policies and practices that you exhibit, and I think end up in the relationships that you build so that we can strengthen community. I really hope that in these times we think about and pray about where are we feeling called, and that we feel encouragement and bravery to take those steps forward, knowing that we're not doing it alone, that we're part of a larger community and movement, and that we'll look back on this time and say, yes, we did that, and feel really proud of what God has led us into.
Thank you so much, Alex.
Thank you all. This has been wonderful.
Excellent. See you next week. So I've stopped